The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home.
But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since. This morning, for the first time since the hostages were put under lock and key, one of the captives, blindfolded, was brought out into the open.
He is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché.
He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him.
The Iranian Hostage Crisis took place in Tehran, Iran on November 1979. It lasted for about 1 year and 2 months. Actually 444 days to be exact. This was considered a diplomatic crisis between the United States and Iran. This was a situation in which 60 American civilians were held captive in the Tehran Embassy of America. The group responsible for this was the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They were for the revolution that was happening in Iran at the time.
The Iranian hostage crisis ushered in a new wave of diplomacy. In 1908, oil was discovered in Iran, and until World War II, Britain was pretty much the key player in that area. However, once World War II had begun, the Soviet Union began fighting alongside the British to help keep Germany out of the area. 1953, that's where the US comes in. And until then, they had basically advocated for the leadership to stay under Shah Reza Pahlavi. However, they feared that the Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, would begin consolidating too much power, and eventually they feared that Iran would move towards Moscow or towards a more communist government. Cue the CIA. This is where they come in and try to do a coup d'etat of sorts and oust the Prime Minister, putting power right back into the Shah's hands. Westernization in Iran created a bit of a conflict within. Under the Shah and the US support of the Shah, Iran had entered an era of unprecedented prosperity. However, the westernization of the culture started to create a bit of a conflict with the Muslim clergy. Eventually, Shah was able to quell the revolution and exile its leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. 14 years later, however, Khomeini ended up returning. The Shah was weak and another revolution had begun. People believed in Iran that his government was anti-Islamic, and Shah had begun using his secret police force called the Savak to start quelling these dissenters ASAP. The revolution again occurred and Shah had to flee to Egypt. Khomeini returned to applause and cheers from the general public.
Ayatollah Khomeini, he was a huge part of the revolution. He was anti-US sentiment, and he was one of the biggest political / religious figures in Iran, and he was actually banished, or what's the word? Then when he came back, he just intensified this thing because everyone knew who he was and everyone followed him.
Many people say that President Jimmy Carter had lost Iran, and to an extent they were correct. His poor leadership and inability to make decisions on the spot eventually led to the loss of Iran's government and the fear that it would move towards communism and towards the Soviet Union. The inability to make a decision came when President Jimmy Carter was unable to choose between the advice of the State Department and his National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. His National Security Advisor told him to have a tight, firm grip on the revolution and to quell all those who opposed as soon as possible and as efficiently as possible, which could be death. However, the State Department wanted them to have a more relaxed approach to quelling this revolution, which included more peaceful means. Jimmy Carter eventually did not listen to the advice of either, and that eventually was one of the most biggest decision-making flaws which lost Iran. Word came to the US that the Shah had cancer and was soon to die. However, Jimmy Carter was reluctant to invite him back into the US for fear that Iranian citizens would attack American citizens who were still residing in Iran. It was said by President Jimmy Carter's Vice President, Walter Mondale, that Jimmy Carter was pacing around the room with his advisors, unable to choose whether to allow the Shah back in. However, on humanitarian grounds, eventually the president decided to let the Shah back into the US to deal and negotiate. On November 4th, a mob of Iranian students overran the US embassy, holding 60 people hostage. No one knew who the mob represented or who they were acting for. In fact, 9 months earlier, a similar situation occurred in which the US embassy had been taken by another group of Iranians. At the time, Khomeini had called for the release of these hostages. However, this time, the leader realized the importance of the situation and how he could use this occurrence to consolidate his own power around a potent symbol of revolution. 1 week after the embassy was overtaken by the mob, President Jimmy Carter embargoed all Iranian oil. 6 days after that, on November 17th, Khomeini took a stab at the US, saying that he would release African Americans, women, and children, for they had already been oppressed by American society enough. At this point, 53 hostages remained, including only 2 women and 1 African American. The president tried his best to use as little military force as possible. His initial approach to the situation was through a lot of economic sanctions, and in fact he froze the assets of Iran using the United States Secretary of the Treasury. However, eventually Jimmy Carter realized that Iran was not going to listen and was not going to release these hostages. He eventually unleashed a mission called Desert One, and this mission had been in the works for a few months. However, Jimmy Carter was devastated. The mission failed horribly as 3 helicopters malfunctioned, and in fact 1 crashed into another plane, causing the death of 8 servicemen and the injuries of 3 others. This devastation to the US was a sign to the Iranian people of American impotence.
The U.S. attempts to negotiate with Iran for the release of the hostages failed, which left the U.S. with no options but to try and forcibly extract them. The first attempt, known as Operation Eagle Claw, which was ordered by President Jimmy Carter on April 23rd, used ships that were guarding the waters near Iran, but failed. There are conflicting reports as to whether mechanical failures were to blame for the failed attempts or mistakes made by American political leaders and military leaders. Whatever actually happened on that infamous night, we'll never know. However, we do know that the failure of this operation caused the death of 8 American servicemen and 1 Iranian citizen.
It's important to note that all of these events occurred over a long span of time. None of them occurred day after day. In fact, it was months before Desert One actually happened. The following summer, after Desert One was uneventful, people were gearing up for the next presidential election in America. And in Iran, political events were, well, silent. Eventually, Khomeini decided it was time to release the hostages just out of humanitarian reasons and because nothing much was happening in this whole deadline. President Jimmy Carter attempted in his final hours of presidency to get the hostages out while his term was still intact. However, he failed as minutes after Ronald Reagan recited his oath, Khomeini decided to release the hostages, leaving a lasting impression on President Jimmy Carter's term as, well, failed.